It's time for episode 94 of The Crisis Show here on Google Hangouts, on YouTube, on Twitter, and wherever else you have this link around the world. Today, we're going to talk about that high-profile, controversial speech before Congress by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the impact of that speech on a lot of different audiences here in the United States, in Israel, and around the world. Good evening from New York. My name is Rich Klein. I'm president of Rich Klein Crisis Management and founder and host of The Crisis Show. Got a great panel joining me for this discussion today. First of all, from Las Vegas, Nevada, he is a principal at the West Third Group, Greg Brooks. How are you, Greg? Nice to see you again.
Good to see you again, Rich.
Great. And in the middle of my film strip here, an original co-host and founder of The Crisis Show. So glad to have him back. He is probably, in my view, the top or very close to the top crisis management experts anywhere. Jonathan Bernstein of Bernstein Crisis Management out of Monrovia, California. Hey, Jonathan, nice to see you.
Thanks, Rich. Your check's in the mail.
And a first-timer to the show. We're so thrilled to have him. He is the D.C. Bureau Chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which I believe started at the same time as Israel was founded, and I've been a follower of JTA for many years. His name is Ron Kampeas. He also previously worked at the Associated Press for many years. Nice to have you, Ron. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Great. So, gentlemen, so much to talk about on this issue. We had the month-long or 6-week-long build-up until the speech when the first stone was thrown when John Boehner invited Benjamin Netanyahu, and then we had all this back and forth between the White House and Israel and the State Department and the public on this issue about the invitation. And then we had the speech yesterday, and people were watching who was going to show up, who wasn't, and where's your alliances with. And then we're going to look at, of course, the fallout from the speech, the impact of the speech on the negotiations, if any, and on the politicians in Washington, as well as the election coming up in Israel. So, gentlemen, let me start with you, Ron. You've written about this. You've covered Washington. Give us an overview, if you could, about what you saw yesterday in Congress in terms of even body language. What did you see with people who showed up and what you know about those who didn't and what they said? Maybe some highlights.
It was evident right from Netanyahu entering the chamber, walking through it the way that the president does at the State of the Union, how this was going to play out and how it did play out, because Republicans rushed to greet him. They were shaking his hands, and Democrats hung back. Significantly, Nancy Pelosi her body language was really sort of almost grief-stricken. She was very rigid. Her face was like a mask. And afterwards, she said that the speech brought her near tears because she felt that it was so condescending and an insult to Americans. And what was interesting about her is that there were times when everybody stood up and gave a standing ovation, let's say like when Netanyahu praised President Obama at the outset, and there were times when it was Republicans who were standing up, let's say when Netanyahu said that this was a bad deal, and Nancy Pelosi was looking around, checking out to see who was among the Democrats who were standing up. She didn't want them to be standing up. And bad for Netanyahu in this sense was that also hanging back was Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She's the chairman of the Democratic National, she's the chief of the party, basically, and she is probably the most prominent Jewish member of Congress, both in terms of her status, but also in that she's very out there about her Jewishness. She doesn't hide it. She's the one who passed the law that brought about Jewish Heritage Month. She's very pro-Israel, and yet she was hanging back. She was not relating to Netanyahu. She was unhappy that he was there, and that's not good, at least maybe not for Netanyahu, but at least for the pro-Israel community, for AIPAC, when you see Jewish lawmakers hanging back from an Israeli leader.
Yeah, Greg, I want to turn to you. You have advised the Republican government officials, and what was your take? Let's go back a little bit on the invitation itself, and your view of, was this a good decision or not a good decision by John Boehner, and how does that affect protocol between Congress and the White House, but more importantly between Boehner and Obama? Did this make things worse, if that's even possible?
Well, I don't know that things can be worse. You've got Boehner has the tougher needle to thread because he's getting a lot of pressure. Indeed, all the Republicans are getting a lot of pressure from their base. We're now scooting into March, and the base has not seen some of the things they want to see turning up on the floor of Congress. And indeed, the net effect of Netanyahu showing up when he did was to squelch some of the negative headlines regarding giving up. Again, this is how the base sees it: giving up on immigration. I think that the real damage here reputationally is what happens with negotiations moving forward, and not just negotiations between Iran and the nations of the West, but negotiations on future issues between not merely Netanyahu and Obama, but the West and Israel. That is, it's not the sexy news cycle, oh my gosh, Netanyahu showed up headline, but it really is the greater damage here. The Republicans got what they wanted out of this, which was a show of power and some deflection from current problems. Netanyahu certainly got what he wanted out of it. What this was is, I know there was weeks of buildup, but this is the equivalent of sort of a highly publicized one-night stand. Everybody got what they needed. Nobody kissed on the lips.
Although there was some kissing and with the Netanyahu, I think, in Congress. Well, Jonathan, I want to turn to you. We talk a lot in our business about how important in crisis management actions and words. And in my mind, looking back from the start of this invitation, there were headlines of words, provocative, arrogant, things that stood out. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Are public officials, at least in this scenario, do you think that they're going overboard and going public with their thoughts too much about, and not realizing the power of those words when they make a comment and call somebody provocative or an action arrogant? Talk to me about it.
I think, first of all, I think there's a reason why I assiduously avoid having politicians as clients, and I will leave that to Greg. But you have to look. I mean, this was, from a straight PR perspective, this was a stunt. This was a giant PR stunt, and PR stunts can work very well, and they can also backfire. And you really don't know till after they've been pulled how successful they've been. And they ultimately, if our friend Mark Toohey, who's in our profession up in Canada, says communication has been successful when the desired result has been achieved. If Netanyahu gets out of this what he wanted to get out of this, then he's been successful from his point of view. As an American citizen who, as a former intelligence officer, does think Iran is a threat, and I do, then I would say that if the American public is more aware of just how much of a threat Iran is, that's successful too. But politicians' motives tend to be tied directly to votes, and the end result in Israel as well as the end result here is what will dictate the success of what he did.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess what I heard from you, Jonathan, is two things. Yes, it was a stump, but there was also some real meat on the bones on what he had to say. That, at least in my view, that the American public, who many people are not following these negotiations in Switzerland, and I think because of the speech, it kind of put it on the front pages and put it on the cable news. I know the ABC, CBS, NBC didn't broadcast it, but certainly CNN did, and it certainly was broadcast online. I think JTA, Ryan, your network broadcast it as well. So I think for people who don't typically pay attention, they are probably a little more aroused or about this.
I also think, if I could interject quickly, Rich, just evaluating him as a communicator. I mean, the 3 C's of effective crisis communications is you need to come across as compassionate, confident, and competent, and he did a very good job of that. He's a very believable and credible speaker, and so I think that helped. Since 85–90% of communication is nonverbal, I think that did help carry his message a lot better. Aside from the politicians who are looking at it from a different perspective than your average American or the average Israeli would look at it.
Hey, Ryan,
I'm sorry.
Right, go ahead quickly if you can. Yeah.
Lest we leave him off the discussion, I dare say the president came out as much of a winner as was possible given the circumstance he was presented with. You know, if you're painted into a corner and the only dance move you have is a pirouette, okay, then pirouette effectively. And given the tenor and tone of how we know this administration is capable of responding to things they don't like, I'd say that they walked out of this pretty well. You know, they're not having a good week. Let's not confuse it with that. But they also avoided some unforced errors.
Ron, what do you think in terms of who may have been damaged, who may not have, and who looked like a winner here, if anyone?
I think Greg's right. I think the administration pirouetted pretty well. I think it was interesting that the very same day that this was taking place, John Kerry was at the UN Human Rights Commission or Council in Geneva, and he was speaking on Israel's behalf. He was defending Israel because it's a body that's notoriously anti-Israel. And the administration, at least in terms of its relations with the Jewish community, was able to say, and this is something that they kept on stressing throughout the AIPAC conference, which was coincident with this, hey, we still have Israel's back. Whatever happens here, we still have Israel's back. And they were, and like you said, instead of retreating into thin-skinnedness, they did the kind of the big thing, and that was smart for them. I think the loser here has always been the pro-Israel community, AIPAC, because they were caught off guard. They did not know that Netanyahu was going to do this. AIPAC's whole cachet is knowing what the Israelis are going to do, and here he makes an announcement, or John Boehner makes an announcement, January 21st, that there's going to be a speech, and they didn't know that was going to happen. And more substantively is also just the fact that it's become a safe zone for Democrats who are critical of Israel to be outspoken in that criticism, as we saw with Nancy Pelosi, who was the party leader right after the speech. I mean, there were 6 Jewish lawmakers who are among the 60 who didn't attend. 4 of them, they don't live in areas, they don't represent areas that have big Jewish constituencies, but 2 of them do. Jan Schakowsky from Chicago and Al Franken from Minnesota. Very, very pro-Israel people. Between them have taken a lot of pro-Israel actions, and here they are coming out against the prime minister. That's very bad news for AIPAC. They need to be bipartisan. Their messages, and they kept on stressing this throughout the AIPAC conference, that they are bipartisan. They have both parties on side, and they still do as far as Israel goes, but not as far as this particular Israeli government goes.
Hey, Ron, I wanted to ask you just to follow up on that. That was a really good explanation. Do you think that the Democrats that sat out, I think there was a total of 60 members that sat out, of that, do you think that was driven by, do you think there was a campaign by the White House to say, you better do this or risk some political pain down the road? Or do you think this was really a decision of individual consciousness?
I think it was both. I think not the White House. I don't think the White House was so much involved. I think that the grassroots left was definitely involved. You know, I subscribed to all the activist organizations on both left and right. I was getting lots of move on stuff in my inbox saying, "Tell your member not to attend this speech." So they were getting that kind of pressure. I think that there was a case of personal conscience. I think the other blow for the pro-Israel community, I was mentioning the Jewish lawmakers, is the Congressional Black Caucus. There were some African-American congressmen there. They were also being unenthusiastic. A lot of them sat it out. You had John Lewis, who is a civil rights hero, who's actually got a pretty good pro-Israel record in Congress, and he sat it out because of the optics of the thing. If you remember, Boehner issues his invitation the day after the State of the Union, and then it's almost like Boehner is saying, okay, and I'm not saying this is what he was saying. I'm saying this is how it could be perceived in the black community, and I've heard from people it is how it's perceived. He's saying the day after the black president speaks, now we're going to get a white leader to speak to counter that, and that's terrible optics in terms of black-Jewish relations. I don't know how much that lasts or whether that has a long impact, but it's certainly something that's made people in the pro-Israel community very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and just to follow up, Ron, because you're close with the AIPAC people, what is their view of this administration? I imagine from what I've read, it's mixed. With some of the comments that have been made by the State Department when they had the anti-Semitic attacks in Paris, the president called them random folks. Is that just is there some reality to that, or what is your view of this president with view towards Israel and the Jewish people compared to his predecessors?
That's a whole book I plan to write one day. But I mean, there's a you talk to the top AIPAC people, and it's not like the rank and file who see like Barack Hussein Obama as a Muslim who's out to get the Jews or anything like that. They do appreciate, and Netanyahu does appreciate the closeness of the relationship in a lot of spheres in terms of military cooperation, intelligence cooperation. I mean, one of the anomalies of Barack Obama being perceived as anti-Israel is that he's the first president, I think, since Johnson, who hasn't taken punitive action against Israel. I mean, even George W. Bush, in terms of withholding loan guarantees, George W. Bush, considered to be the closest president to Israel, actually suspended the strategic dialogue for 3 years because Israel was selling arms to China until they sorted out. That was suspended. So it's acknowledged that there's this very close relationship. The issue where there is a substantive agreement, and it came out here, is on Iran. Barack Obama believes that he's a strong believer in engaging even the most vile dictatorships, in squeezing them at the same time, using sanctions to pressure them, but in believing that he can moderate their behavior. The Republicans in Congress and a lot of Democrats as well, chief among them Robert Menendez of New Jersey, and AIPAC and Israel, believe that to the degree that you can moderate the behavior of dictatorships, it has to be done much more through pressure and not through carrots or persuasion.
Jonathan, I want to turn back to you because we talk about communications all the time, and let's talk, if you will. And I don't know how much you've looked into this, analyzed it, but let's look at the president and look at John Kerry in terms of their success or non-success in communicating their stance on these negotiations, or even on any foreign policy issue. How have they done, in your view, in analyzing this since they took office?
Well, I think in general, and I'll speak as someone who voted for Barack Obama twice and is now disappointed, because I think the foreign policy, whatever they've been doing behind the scenes, and as has been pointed out, we don't know everything that goes on behind the scenes, but publicly they come across as pretty wishy-washy, particularly the president, and his deliberate, slow, let's negotiate about anything policy comes across as indecisive on a public end of things. Now, is that actually happening behind the scenes that way? Is there more meat and leverage to what he's talking about than what we see publicly? I don't know, but I think the brilliant public speaker that we saw in campaigns has not been anywhere near as present in foreign affairs.
And also the same question about John Kerry versus Hillary Clinton. Do you see a difference in the communication skills, if you will, and the influence?
I think they're just. I don't see Kerry or Clinton as more or less effective than each other. They each had their own style. I remain not particularly impressed by either one of them as communicators.
Well, and states' effectiveness is always impacted by the president's interest in and engagement in foreign policy. Our president would much rather focus on domestic issues.
Interesting.
Good point.
Yeah, Ron, any thoughts on that? It's just so close to it.
In terms of
their ability to effectively express their positions to the American public or whoever the audience is.
Yeah, I don't know that Hillary Clinton has, she's never struck me as a particularly engaging communicator. She holds back too much. It's when she's off topic, she's more interesting. When she's looser and laughing, she's much more interesting. But she is so constrained that she's never. And I think this haunted her during the 2008 election. This is what helped to propel Barack Obama to the forefront. She's just very careful, and she's continuing to be very careful now that she's stepping back into the race. And John Kerry, he thinks aloud. I think that's always a problem in terms. You guys are the communications experts, but as far as the reporter goes, thinking aloud has always been a problem for I find it engaging and interesting because we get to see what the thought processes are. On the other hand, when it leads you to say something like "I was before it before I was against it," it undercuts your effectiveness. So and he does that a lot in terms of describing what's going on in the Middle East, because it's so complex and it requires a great deal of thought. But you almost wish that he would come to the microphone with his thoughts already formed.
Can I just express a moment of deep dismay that we never got to see a Joe Biden sex state? It would have been one for the ages.
Talk about thinking aloud.
Exactly.
Well, Joe Biden has he's been the laughing stock in some memes online with getting cozy with his hands on shoulders. I'll leave it there for the moment, but that's been his kind of attention he's getting. Actually, I want to ask you about that, Ron. Were you surprised? I guess maybe there's no surprise when that Biden didn't show up yesterday because the president was being dissed, right?
Right. No. Yeah. He said that. The word was, of course, the vice president normally co-chairs these events when there's a joint meeting of Congress, right. And then the word was that Biden wouldn't go because he would be out of town. He was in Guatemala. Interestingly, they didn't announce that he was going to be in Guatemala until like a week ago. So it's like they were looking for a country to send him to, so he could be out of town. It wasn't like it was planned long in advance. So that just underscored the degree to which the White House was not okay with how this all played out. The visuals were very much that this was a Republican event and not a joint Democratic-Republican event.
Yeah, the thing is, and this is more of a question from my more political affairs savvy fellow columnist. Everything inside the Beltway right now is a political event. I mean, it's been a long time now, unfortunately, in a few administrations since we had a Congress that didn't have an approval rating of about 15% right now publicly, and so it's either the Republicans upstaging the Democrats or the Democrats upstaging the Republicans, and both engaged in obstructionism in every way they possibly can. So how is this different than business as usual for them?
Yeah, Greg, you want to jump in on that thought by any chance? Anything you want to?
I would love to, but I need you to repeat the question because my connection twinked out for a second.
Oh. Well, it wasn't much of a question. I was asking if you could comment on what Jonathan said, which is that Congress's approval ratings, or let's say disapproval ratings, are so high, the approval ratings are so low, and not getting things done.
And yet they have an extraordinarily high re-election rate. And I think against that backdrop, at a certain point, you quit worrying about Congress's approval ratings, and it's the law of the jungle. What do I need to do to get reelected? And it's like a school of fish. Those fish are all moving individually and all have free will, but it tends to look like an orchestrated action.
Yeah, as my former political science professor Alan Shawtek said, first you have to get elected, and everything else comes after that.
And I hope I'll have your support.
So just to wrap this segment up on Netanyahu, the speech, anybody can speak up on this one. Do you think that the speech will impact the negotiations in any way? Do you think they'll extend the windows or anything like that? Do you think it'll make the Democrats negotiate harder against the Iranians now that so much more information is out there?
I think that there's an increased skepticism. There's always been a skepticism of the talks. There's an increased skepticism now because one thing that the whole process was this: it was leaked that Netanyahu was going to talk about this sunset clause that whatever deal comes out goes away after 10 to 15 years. And so Susan Rice kind of preempted him, and she said, yes, there is probably going to be a specific duration. It's going to be for at least 10 years, and that's because you can't negotiate a deal without writing a new duration into it. So the administration tried to seize the moment with that, but it still has Congress members worried. So Dianne Feinstein, who is one of the biggest critics of the speech, very strong critic of Netanyahu, she actually said, as much as I didn't like the speech, I do believe that that's something that we have to look at. And so when the whole idea of giving the speech now is to try and get it out before the March 24th deadline for the outline of an agreement. The actual agreement deadline is for July the 1st. And so now going into that March 24th deadline, you do have Democrats more skeptical of how that whatever period comes out of the agreement, what that looks like. Is it going to be 10 to 15 years? Is it going to be 20 years? And will there be things that last beyond the agreement? Susan Rice said there would be, but I think Democrats are going to be looking for particulars.
Interesting. And Greg, to you, I understand the Republicans have drawn up a bill because they want to be involved. If there was a very interesting discussion I heard on CNN today about whether this is a treaty or an agreement and how much a role Congress should or should not play in approving it.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Look, the president needs a win. It has been a while since the president's had a win, and I believe, I'm not a mind reader, but I believe the calculus is not what's the deal I can get from Iran. The calculus with that speech has now shifted to what's the deal I can get that's not going to end up in court or on the floor of Congress. And I don't know how big a shift that is from his previous position. Only the president knows that. But I think he would be foolish not to be thinking in terms of viewing it that way. Just as an aside, it's interesting. One of my clients is the organized pro-democracy resistance in exile from Iran that's sprinkled around the globe. And this has not been a big issue for them. They are busy. We talk a lot about Iran's nuclear program, but in this last 2 to 3 week cycle, it hasn't ramped up the way you've seen it ramp up in the general American political press and in the Israeli press. They're focused on the same big issues. They have been focused on things like the rights of women in Iran.
Yeah, and of course, one thing I did hear today and have been reading about is the sanctions. The sanctions are hurting the Iranian people, and that is ostensibly what brought them to the table to this point. So,
I think there's also, Richard.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, there's also something, and again, this is more me as a spectator than as a commentator, but there's also something lurking not very far behind the scenes here that's got to be playing a factor in somebody's minds, and I'm wondering what Ron thinks about it, which is what's the possibility if a deal does not please Israel or Israel's government, that Israel will take preemptive action against Iran.
Right.
There is a possibility. It's the question is, how wise would that military action be? Because one of the dilemmas for Netanyahu is Israel's strategy has always been to go it alone. In any of its past actions, whether it's bombing the nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981, whether it is bombing the Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007, it to a degree defied the American leadership at the time and went ahead and did it. The problem with Iran is that the damage that Israel can inflict might actually precipitate a war, which would be very bad for Israel and not set back the nuclear development there. The Americans could actually an American strike could probably set it back for a couple of years, which is why Netanyahu went to Congress to make his case. The Israeli security establishment is very, very much against a strike. Benny Gantz, who was the military chief of staff and until just a few weeks ago, said that while he was military chief of staff, he advised against it, and that reflects the consensus, because it's the pushback would be very, very hard for Israel. But Netanyahu also it seems that he feels cornered on this. I think a lot depends on who's prime minister next month as well. There's a March 17th election to go through before we get to the March 24th.
What's public opinion on that, Ron, in Israel?
On a strike?
Yes.
I against it. I mean, Israelis know that that they'll become an immediate target. It's not just the prospect of an actual war with Iran after a strike. That might not happen, but it's the prospect of unleashing Hezbollah, which is the terrorist organization in Lebanon that's currently preoccupied with Syria, but that has built up a massive missile capability since the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. Tens of thousands of missiles hidden in bunkers across Lebanon. The last war emptied out Israel's north. It created an internal refugee problem. It's not something that Israelis want to see again.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Rich. Go ahead.
Yeah, very quick point. I was going to turn to you anyway, Greg. It was very interesting, gentlemen, that during the speech yesterday, I thought it was interesting the way that Netanyahu laid out not just Iran, not just a nuclear Iran, but the tentacles of Iran's sponsorship of terrorism in other places that I wasn't even aware of. And I think to the extent that was true, I guess you have to do your fact checking there, but that was, I think, a wake-up call for a lot of people, because a lot of this is, people in Israel probably know it, but I think a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere are not aware of that. So that was an interesting part of his argument, I thought. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, 2 points. One is that I believe the voice of Saudi Arabia has been conspicuously silent on the Iran nuke deal, and that intrigues me because I'm sure there are some in Israel who would disagree, but I believe the Saudis are every bit as twitchy as Israel about any possibility of a nuclear Iran. The other thing that comes to mind. I'm sorry, I've lost the other thing that came to mind.
I think that's called pulling a Perry. Yeah, no, the Israelis are actually very cognizant of how unhappy the Saudis are with any prospective deal. It's something that Netanyahu mentions, not just the Saudis, but the other Sunni Arab nations in the region. There is a real, and the Saudis say it out loud. There's a Saudi columnist today on Al Arabiya who said, I found myself agreeing with Benjamin Netanyahu, which I've never done in my life, listening to the speech yesterday. And the fact that he could say that. I mean, he's not going to get any pushback from the Saudis for saying that, because they're pretty much saying it themselves. They're hinting it in public, and they're saying it outright in private meetings.
Well, the Saudi opposition has created some of the biggest leaders of Al Qaeda over the years, and the monarchy is very acutely aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I also thought it was one other thing that jumped out at me in that speech, and of course he got a standing ovation from it, was the time when Netanyahu said, "The enemy of your enemy is your enemy," referring, of course, to Iran some of the Iranian fighters trying to defeat ISIS. Another dynamic that pulls into this conversation as well. So, anybody else have any? Before we turn to a shorter segment, we're going to turn to the Hillary Clinton email scandal, or what is becoming a bigger scandal this afternoon. Is there any? But before we get to that, anybody want to say anything else about the Netanyahu matter? Anything else? We covered a lot of it. So thank you all for that part of it. And Ron, if you want to stick around, be my guest. I know I didn't call you in today for talk about Hillary. Feel free to jump out if you like, or just listen into the three of us pontificate, whatever your comfort level is. But gentlemen, just late story today that there's a House Investigative Committee is now going to subpoena the emails from Hillary Clinton's personal account. So the ratchet has been it's been ratcheted up, this whole story. For those of you just learning about this, big story that broke yesterday about Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, used a personal email account to conduct business. And there's a big debate going on about whether those emails were saved to the official State Department server, so archivists and freedom of information requests can be dealt with. So there's a big thing going on. Apparently she also had her own server that tracked back to her home in Chappaqua, New York, not far from me. So, gentlemen, Hillary is supposed to announce very soon. How does this affect her? Anybody?
Well, I've got a cynical answer, which is that among her core supporters, it won't affect her at all. And among the machine portion of the Democrat Party, whether it will or won't affect her is different from it can't really affect her, because the bench is very, very thin behind Hillary. That's whether that's default or design, I don't know, but it's not like we have a lot of viable, high-profile, tested Democrats ready to jump into the presidential race. So I think that they're going to lock ranks around her. Look, she broke the law. If she did this, she broke the law. The law is extraordinarily clear on this. I would love for that to matter. I'm cynical enough to think that it probably doesn't matter. our presidential politics are so very, very driven by party affiliation and people's early passionate opinions about people. I don't think this changed anybody's mind in a statistically significant way, unless we find something juicy in those emails.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
Well, I think, I mean, talk about preventable crises.
Oh, amen.
I mean, this is. Somebody has to have said to her. If they didn't, I can't imagine why not. Somebody who received an email from her, somebody on her staff must have said, "Hey, this is going to look bad. Forget the law breaking or not. This is going to look really stupid. You know, how can anybody in your position think that this is okay to do? And why would you do it in the first place? I mean, even if your private email is more secure." And that's something that still needs to be proven. I mean, she absolutely has to come out with some proof that what she did was as or more secure than any government communication, which is possible because, you know, we already know government communication isn't that secure. But assuming that it was, why would she do that? I mean, there's no good reason that I can think of. And so it calls her entire judgment into question on a broader scale. And unfortunately, the way the public works is they judge how well an airline can fly by whether the tray, you know, that pulls down from the chair is dirty. It's that type of superficial thing that can make a big difference. And so if she's capable of that kind of incredibly poor judgment, and I don't think there's any question that it was poor judgment at a minimum, law separate from it, then what else has she made stupid decisions about? And that's a question that it raises in my mind and in the minds of thinking voters. And not every voter is a thinking voter, but minds of thinking voters, you'd wonder, why the heck would she do that?
Yeah, you know, Greg, you made a very good point, and I wonder if either of you could help me with this. You know, I was watching a little bit of the CPAC stuff because I'm always entertained by the cast of characters there. Well, there are 15, 20 people trying to be president, coming and going, and depending on the straw poll in Iowa, it changes. Why is it that here we are, 2015, we've been a two-party system since our founding, and we have like 15, 20 people trying to run for president on the Republican side, and Hillary Clinton on the other. We have, as you said, Greg, a thin bench. Well said. But why is that, gentlemen? Is there any logical explanation for that?
Well, it makes. I can speak to the Republican side because, you know, those are my people, right? There are a lot of people who are running for their next job, and that next job is not to be the Republican presidential nominee. Lindsey Graham is not running for president. Lindsey Graham is running for a position in the next Republican administration. We also have some folks who are, you know, through dint of too many sycophantic friends or brain chemistry that needs adjustment, they think they're up to the job and they're not. You know, I have a lot of friends who will be heartbroken, but Dr. Ben Carson is not going to be the Republican nominee either. You know, there's a sense that there's an opening. The libertarian in me would like to point out that the government and control of the government is such an incredibly large prize that it universally brings out everybody's grab for power and corruption. Okay, there are people running for president specifically so they can get a toehold into whoever becomes president, and that's why we have a big field on the GOP side. Plus, you know, we've got organized crazies, and I use that word with some affection and some disgust, who are capable of elevating marginal candidates in a way that in the past the party mechanism would have thwarted.
Certain pair of brothers comes to mind.
Yeah.
I eagerly await my check from them.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me. I mean, it's almost like you know, since Hillary left state, this was supposed to happen. But it also, you know, this whole thing, I think, gentlemen, I think we'd all agree, not just us, but people who have been following the Clintons for many years, it kind of plays into this narrative that they have of playing by different rules. I think the challenge, first of all, a couple of things that came to mind. I was reading Howard Kurtz, the media analyst who's now at Fox News, and he was talking about this crisis, and he said, well, she doesn't really have a campaign staff yet, so she doesn't have enough flax to help her. And I answered him online saying, you know what, it's not about how many and I told him I don't like the word flax, by the way. So we're crisis managers, we're PR people. Don't call us flax. But anyway, I said in a response that, I would advise her, because I think this is going to blow up in her face. And I think that if she accepts responsibility now and apologizes, it may not save her, but it certainly will minimize the damage, and she'll regain control of the story and her reputation. I think the longer she lets this go, this is not going to stop, because the media, if the media doesn't like anybody, it's Hillary Clinton, and that's been and the Clintons, I should say, together over the years, and they're going to be like pit bulls on this one. So, Jonathan, I wonder what your advice would be. I gave you my suggestion that she does. What do you think she can do?
I would agree with you that she should do whatever it takes to put this behind her as quickly as possible, and that means a mea culpa. In hindsight, I probably should have done this differently. I regret that. Regret any cause. I want to assure you that it was highly secured. We'll make sure that copies of everything does end up in the government record. Of course, she could always do a Bill Clinton and said, well, depends on how you define email.
Right. And just as a thought exercise, can either of you recall over the last 20 years of her national political exposure, can either of you recall Hillary Clinton ever issuing a mea culpa?
I have not. Great point. Yeah.
But she's married to someone who's real experienced at
it. Well,
and you're right, Greg. That does play. And that for anybody out there who is going to vote in 2016 and may be on the fence about her, to a lot of people, this is what we talk about all the time about our politicians, right? Of playing by different rules, and this is that perfect storm for that narrative.
Well, let me interject, Rich. This is a chance for Hillary to do what she's never done, which is become a human being.
Right.
If she's willing to humanize herself by finally getting humble, she could turn these lemons into lemonade.
The poor woman's still in shock from when she left the White House and was broke. We need to be cutting her a break.
Yeah, send her a check, right? How many millions does she get when she speaks, right? And the books.
Well, and Bill,
between the two of them, yeah, it's an amazing empire they got building there. So, what I want to ask you, Greg, is about this. Is this just another example of this subpoenaing of her emails? I actually think this is legitimate, but this is different than Benghazi, right?
Look, it is legitimate because a person who's in line for the presidency broke a very significant law. If this happened, okay, so I'll start from the position of believing it's legitimate. However, we have diluted the value of hearings and subpoenas in Congress to the point where it's just one more thing that's going to get a lot of airtime on Fox and a little bit of airtime everywhere else.
Good point.
Nobody's paying attention.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this, gentlemen? Before we wrap up? Oh.
Has anybody called it Hillary-gate yet?
You might want to trademark it and get it out on Twitter right away.
Email servers are typically called mail gateways, so maybe there's some predecessor there. One of the things that will be interesting, we're now at this point we're game playing it, right? But if she did it and she controls the servers, she has the ability to delete email more effectively than anybody else but that doesn't say anything about the people she sent sensitive emails to. So even if she picks through every email and deletes out the sensitive stuff on her server, there's this great hanging liability out there among people she hopes she can trust.
Right, and there's a larger story here. Of course, the story that the crisis that came before this was taking donations from foreign countries. That was the other issue, right? And so this is sort of like part two to that story, if you will. I don't see these stories being separated going forward.
Plus, I guarantee you, every hacker in the world right now is trying to find her server.
Yep.
Directly or indirectly, either through people she communicated with or directly to find her server, which if she's got any brains left in her IT team, she would have already switched to some different server. But so she's become now even a bigger target than she ever was for people to find out what was on her private server.
Yeah.
You know, just as an aside, remember the Sony hack a couple of months ago? That one Sony executive's email file and contacts were exposed. I believe Hillary Clinton was in those contacts, and I believe that the emails of hers that were exposed were not sex state, emails, not actual to and from emails, but her contact file showing a list of emails, cell phone numbers, things like that. It would be interesting to go back and see what other emails were in there.
Sure.
That she's using. Give her attackers multiple vectors to investigate.
Interesting. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This was a great show, obviously. I want to, first of all, just thank our viewers for watching around the world. I want to thank Ron Kampeas, the Washington Bureau Chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. I didn't get a chance to thank him and say goodbye. He checked out. So thank you, Ron, if you watch the replay. From Las Vegas, from the West 3rd Group, Greg Brooks, always a pleasure. Jonathan Bernstein, Crisis Manager. I'm glad you two met, by the way. I think it was a great show to have you guys on together. And we'll do it again soon. So thank you very much. If anybody wants to watch past episodes of The Crisis Show, please visit www.thecrisisshow.com. Our Twitter account is @TheCrisisShow. You could also use hashtag The Crisis Show. You could also find Jonathan and Greg through our Twitter feed. You could communicate with them as well on their Twitter feed. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rich.
Take care.
Bye-bye.